Kimberly told you a little bit about myself, how I graduated last year from this school, University of Baltimore, earning an MFA in Creative Writing and Publishing Arts. And while I was there, I wrote Street Magic Stories and Tales. So the first story I'm going to begin with is Elvis. Elvis means a lot to me because it was my first published story. It appeared as a web exclusive for the New Voices Writers, New Voices Emerging Writers issue of the Urbanite. The date was August 2009. So, Elvis. Okay, Elvis. I moved into Mr. Jones's neighborhood when Daddy left us for a raggedy woman who was known for going around brawlers and stealing churchwomen's husbands. Anyway, me, and my little sister moved into the brick row house on a Saturday evening. There was still light outside when me and Sis were playing hopscotch on a vacant sidewalk when we saw him, and boy, was he a sight. Mr. Jones was on his porch conversing with some old woman who had a red bandana tied around her head. She was the color of cream, and he the color of asphalt. His skin looked like soft velvet, so smooth and rich that it looked like you could peel his skin with a butter knife. He was tall, so tall that he could shame the giraffe at the Baltimore Zoo. And to top it off, he had eyes the color of sun and grass mixed together. Once we got to know him better, we would jokingly call him the black kitty giraffe behind his back, but he never heard us. And I doubt he would have cared if he had. He would have probably smiled his big smile, exposed his perfect teeth, and flashed his pink kitty tongue. And boy, could Mr. Jones talk. He talked like a Princeton scholar. He would use words like splendid and tremendous to describe things he liked. Like the time Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. Everybody was crowded around their TV, huddled like football players, discussing an important game-winning play. Of course we didn't have one, but it didn't matter because Mr. Jones described in minute detail everything that happened. Armstrong raising the flag, Armstrong hopping like a bunny, Armstrong saying, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." And Mr. Jones spoke with a British accent, even though he had no family in England. He was born and raised in Baltimore City. We asked him why he talked like that, and he said, "Because I do kitties." And he flashed his big smile, white teeth, and pink kitty tongue. And not only did Mr. Jones speak the Queen's English, he could add, multiply, subtract, and divide any numbers you threw at him, like 789,647,712 times 592,758,956. And he memorized every city, capital, and country in the entire world. He had a photographic memory. If you showed him a page from a book, he could recite the passage verbatim. And he was a walking encyclopedia. If we had a trivia question, we would knock on his door, and he would look at us with those cat eyes and give us the answer. Mr. Jones was the smartest man I've known. But all those things I mentioned weren't his best talent. Mr. Jones's best talent was reading people or predicting the future, whatever you want to call it. He discovered the gift at age 10 when a white man came to kill his mother. I know you probably think that I'm pulling your leg, but I'm not. Mr. Jones, who towered over his mother at the time, was dribbling his basketball on the sidewalk when a white killer man demanded to see his mother. As the white man was talking, Mr. Jones felt needles repeatedly stabbing him in the gut. They weren't real needles, of course, but that's how it felt, like sharp edges digging deep into his epidermis. Anyway, Mr. Jones wanted to throw up the bacon and cheese sandwich he ate earlier at Melba's place. His mama gave him a treat for his birthday. He trembled and shouted, "No, you can't see, Mama." Years later, we found out that the white man was a serial killer stalking and preying on impoverished Negro women. and children. In the newspaper articles, he was dubbed a ghost. At the time, nothing about the white man suggested this, but Mr. Jones knew those pains in his stomach meant something. Killer, killer, killer. So Mr. Jones told the white man that his mother was long dead and gone, and the white man called him a nigger bastard who deserved to be beat to a pulp. And Mr. Jones called the white man a devil and told him to get off his damn porch. Then his mama came down the stairs, demanding to know what the commotion was. But by this time, the white killer man had disappeared like an apparition. Where was I? Mr. Jones was brilliant. He read novels and plays and the Bible and magazines and newspapers. I would watch him as he sat on his porch surrounded by newspapers, the sun kissing his ebony skin. To me, it looked like he received newspapers from all over the country. Los Angeles, Texas, New York, Newark, Richmond, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C. Mr. Jones told me the first time he saw a newspaper, he was intrigued by all those words. The smoothness and smell of the paper made him feel that he entered a magical world where there were no broken down water fountains for colored children and pristine fountains for white children, or not being able to try on shirts and pants and shoes at the major department stores downtown, and no signs that read, whites only, no niggers allowed. During his childhood, Mr. Jones was a big fan of the Baltimore Afro-American. He would read about what was going on in the community and the nation, who was getting married, who was promoted, and who became the first of their race. And even then, he instantly knew who was guilty and who was innocent. Like the time he saw the Afro photograph of Eddie, the bald man who lived up the street from him, under the headline, Murder Suspect. Mr. Jones knew he was innocent, a voice told him. It said, Jones, that man is innocent. The guilty man is Corey, the cook at Melvin's place. Mr. Jones refused to hear that voice. Corey was such a soft-spoken man. In fact, Corey always put extra onions, tomatoes, and lettuce on his hamburger. How could he do such a thing? Nonsense. But sure enough, a week later, the cook at Melvin's was arrested, and Eddie was released from jail. Mr. Jones kept hearing the voice for the next 7 years, when he was writing papers for school, filing out job applications, and driving the car he paid for from his summer jobs. He heard it so much that he thought he was going crazy, until he confided in his best friend, Sylvia, who had moved to Baltimore from North Carolina. She told him that he had a gift and that he should use it to help people. Mr. Jones told Sylvia that he needed a real job. No one would believe him, so he just laughed and tried to block out the voice. But 15 years later, after jobs as an office clerk, teacher, and postal worker, Mr. Jones bought himself a commercial space. He placed a huge sign, "The future is yours," in his window. Brown people with afros walked by the storefront and wondered who the distinguished dark-skinned man reading the New York Times was. They would come in smelling like cigarettes, fruity body sprays, cocoa butter lotion, powder, or plain funk, asking, "Who are you?" And Mr. Jones would look up from his newspaper, examine them in a second, and say that he could tell their future, and that he used his gift to help people, not to make money. Some would walk out the store muttering under their breath, "That man crazy." Others would sit down and shell out $3 to hear their fate. And before he knew it, Mr. Jones became a local celebrity. Mr. Bell didn't like it. Mr. Bell was the white palm reader who had his own shop, the magnificent one, down the block. Within a month, he began to lose his customer once word got around about Mr. Jones. At 8 in the morning, there will be a line of people, brown, white, and yellow, waiting for the tall colored man to open his doors to "The future is yours." And yes, the future was theirs all right. Mr. Bell's store had been on that block for years. And now this Mr. Jones was going to beat him, hell no. First it was the Civil Rights Act, and then it would be him on the street, eating from the garbage can, begging for food, and selling his services out on the street. And Mr. Bell would be damned if a nigger would put him out of business. So he cut his rates and placed huge signs in his windows with bold letters that read, "Free reading and half off." But he still couldn't outdo Mr. Jones, who even appeared on the front page of the Baltimore Sun when he helped solve the murder case. You know, the one that involved the little colored girl found strangled with a pair of Snoopy pajama pants wrapped around her small, fragile neck. That was huge, considering that we rarely made front page, unless it was about how we Negroes were making trouble with protests and demonstrations and riots. 10 years passed and everything was going well for Mr. Jones until he heard a disturbing voice one day. It happened on a Sunday after church services. The voice said, "You're going to die," in a child's voice. Mr. Jones wondered if he had heard correctly. Who was going to die? Surely not him. But Mr. Jones heard the voice again on Wednesday. This time, "You're going to die," was said in an old man's voice. The sandwich that he was eating simply sat in his stomach like a rock. The voice came a third time when he was reading a dashiki-wearing, freckle-faced young woman's future. She wanted to know if her husband would come back after running off with her best friend. He almost told the young woman she was going to die, but he remembered that voice was for him. "You're going to die." After that day, he heard it constantly, "You're going to die," when he was reading a newspaper, eating dinner, sitting on his porch, and talking on the phone. Mr. Jones was determined to find out how he was going to die. He tried to convince the voice to tell him more details. He tried tarot cards. He even went to a psychic. No answers. Mr. Jones went to the Magnificent One as his last resort. He walked in the store wearing his brown suit and shiny black shoes. He asked Mr. Bell to read his hand, and Mr. Bell told him that he couldn't help him, that he didn't have the ability to read a hand like his. And as Mr. Jones was walking out, he could hear Mr. Bell's loud snickers. Who else could help him? Sylvia. "Darling, I keep hearing this voice that says, 'You're going to die, you're going to die.' What should I do?" he asked over the phone. "Child, we are all going to die. Don't be afraid," she said in her thick Southern accent. Mr. Jones felt a little better after talking to her. Why should he be afraid of death? Death was a part of life. So he walked outside to buy the Baltimore Sun. And as he was crossing the street, he was hit by a speeding car. Isn't that crazy? People couldn't believe it when they saw that Mr. Jones was stretched out in the street. The paramedics came, but it was too late. We couldn't believe it when we heard the news from our sobbing mother. How can Mr. Jones die? But he did. People from all over the city came to his funeral. It was like he was Elvis, our Elvis. For that particular story, Elvis, I wrote it because I had a writing prompt in one of my classes. It was called International Fiction, and the writing prompt was to write about a character who had a special gift. And for whatever reason, just a person being able to tell the future really interested me. And as I began to write it, the story began to emerge. So that's how that story was emerged. So.
Anybody, any questions, any thoughts?
There are a lot of great little details in that story. I'm just wondering, how did you come up with the flashy tongue thing? And all the elaborate details about, what he looked like, where he was from, and his friend from, it's just so many little details that kind of got woven together. Mm-hmm. So that's one question. And how did you keep track of all that stuff?
I think my process, I'm a very slow writer compared to other writers. And what I'll do is I'll write, and then I call it sort of like channeling, where it's just thoughts are coming into my mind. And then wherever it stops, I'll stop and then print it out and then read it. And as I'm reading it, I'm adding more details, and then I'll do it over and over again. So as I write each time I print it out, I'm adding more details into it. So that's how it's kind of like interwoven like that. So that's my process. I never have a story where I just write it out and I'm finished. I always like go back multiple times, like multiple times, and just add more details to it.
And the kitty tongue thing, where did you come with that?
I think I was reading Toni Morrison's Jazz, and I think it was a line about like tongues or something, pink tongues. So I like that and decided to add it into my story.
I love the way you use all the senses, that the people who come in and they have all their, you're not describing them visually, you're describing how they smell.
Right. Yeah, me too.
Strong, yeah. Sense of smell is such a strong, memory for all of us, and it's a great way to get to the audience. They're in the room with you.
And it's I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
It's a tale, obviously, because of the exaggeration, but it's such a complex narration because you have this character, this narrator that seems to be a child, but the things that, and then these, and so there's this exaggeration, there's this, and then she says, I'm not pulling your leg, you can believe me.
Right, I love the voice.
Yeah.
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah. And then out of nowhere, there's a little girl being strangled with pajamas, Snoopy pajamas. I mean, so it's hilarious, and then it's just disturbing and poignant. All of that wrapped into this one narration. So it's so many different layers and levels to it.
Anthony,
yeah, I was actually going to ask about that little girl. Was there, when you included that in there, was there a particular case, historical or contemporary, that you were looking at? Because for me, immediately I was thinking like Felicia Barnes sort of situation when I heard it, the girl.
Mm-hmm.
Right, the one who was so awful.
Yes.
Story,
actually, when I wrote that piece, that particular story didn't have me yet. But for about 2 years, I interned at the Afro-American newspapers in its archives. And I remember coming across a story of a young girl being killed in her house. So a lot of things that are in the story, I'll just like pull from different places. So in that particular piece, I was thinking about that particular story, a clipping that I came across while working.
And maybe you don't just mention it though, you use it to make a social commentary that we made the front page for something other than,
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. Unrest. Yeah, what a gold mine, the archives with the Afro-American. That's like Fat City, man.
It's a gift that keeps on giving.
Right, exactly.
What was the decision behind calling it Elvis as opposed to like a black famous person, superstar, as opposed to a white one?
It's a great question.
I always come up with my titles towards the end. So my first title was like The Neighbor Next Door. So I was like, no, I don't really like that. But I think Elvis, I just think this is who this character is. He's sort of like the black superstar. And what does mainstream feel is like the person is Elvis. And I also, because he sort of like died around the same time as Elvis, it's sort of like saying, this is our Elvis.
How did you come up with Mr. Jones? Was he a character that you knew, that your inspirations were? Where did you, with the pieces that became Mr. Jones, where did you draw from?
Well, Mr. Jones loves to read the newspaper, and my father, he always loves to read the newspaper. So that's where that one came. As far as predicting the future, that was just part of my imagination. But the parts about the newspapers, that reminds me of my father.
It's gone.
Okay. So my next story